preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
According to the rabbis, prophecy ceased in Israel with the building of the Second Temple. I had no idea when I sat down and planned this series of lectures last spring, a year ago, that this week's lecture would coincide with the visit of the Prime Minister of the State of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, to the United States. I think it's very sweet of him, however, to make the lecture of the evening far more relevant than it might have been otherwise. There's something so typically Ben-Gurionish about this visit that in a way I can't start to talk about Ben-Gurion even in the ideological framework that I am using in these lectures without making reference to the visit. Isn't it convenient that Brandeis University should decide to award a doctor's degree to the Prime Minister of the State of Israel just about 3 or 4 weeks before the East-West Conference is due to start, and just at the time that Prime Minister Adenauer is in this country, and at a time when Brandeis University doesn't normally award doctor's degrees? Sort of a political Sinai campaign, I have the impression, and I must confess it's a rather extraordinary and wondrous coup. Talking about Ben-Gurion is, in a way, trying to hold lightning in your hand. He is not essentially a systematic thinker. He is not a philosopher by profession, not the kind of man who would sit down and write systematic works. Most of what we know about Ben-Gurion is to be found either from his life, the things that he has actually done and lived, or else from the speeches that he has given on various occasions. What I should like to do this evening is, instead of trying to give you the personality and the spirit of the man, which was so charmingly revealed in television last Wednesday night, when he gave a speech which I guess was as typical of him as anything could be, and in the middle of which he suddenly stopped and decided that maybe he had better use his glasses after all, instead of stumbling over the entire thing. A speech which ranged over everything from the concept of the chosen people, the contribution of the Hindus and the Greeks and the Jews toward creating a proper spiritual picture of man, to the problems that the State of Israel has with its neighbors and what it hopes to accomplish. He's a rather extraordinary personality. It's not the personality I can hope to define for you tonight, but what I'd like to do is, out of the speeches and out of the life that he has lived, to try to give you, through Ben-Gurion, something of the major emphases which I see in the life that he has lived. And more than that, to try through Ben-Gurion to show you where we stand today with the Zionist analysis of what it means to be a Jew in the modern world. This will, unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, be the last time that we shall talk at any great length about the Zionist answer to the question with which we began last October. What does it mean to be a Jew under the circumstances under which modern Jews live? And by understanding Ben-Gurion and what he has made of Zionism, what Zionism has come to be through Ben-Gurion, I think perhaps we can understand that answer best, both the great contribution which it has made to Jewish thinking and Jewish life, and also the problems which arise within it. Now, to begin with, Ben-Gurion has an absolutely astonishing definition of what it means to be a Zionist. He has, in the last few years, created a considerable amount of controversy throughout the Jewish world by Ben-Gurion's definition of Zionism. To Ben-Gurion, a Zionist is a person who comes to live in the State of Israel. Anyone who doesn't come to live in the State of Israel isn't really a Zionist. He said it, and he repeats it and says it over and over again. One can imagine with what dismay this is heard by people who consider themselves Zionists, but aren't in the mood for immigration to the State of Israel. The entire apparatus of the World Zionist Organization and the Jewish Agency and all of these multiple groups around the world whose whole substance is the Zionist activity and way of life. Ben-Gurion says very simply, are you a Zionist? Come live in the State of Israel. We will make provision for helping Jews in countries outside. But if you are not a Zionist, all right, that's up to you. But if you want to call yourself a Zionist, to be a Zionist means to come live in the State of Israel. And what are you waiting for? We need you. We need immigration to the state. We need intelligent people in the state. We need workers in the state to help build the state. The primary basis upon which the state can be established and secure is if it has an adequate population to maintain it in the face of a sea of enemies all around it. An adequate population which can give it a stable economic base in the midst of international economic conditions which fluctuate quite widely at times. Now, this is a terrible shock. It's a terrible shock not only to the people who aren't ready for this kind of thing, but it destroys one of the major answers to what has been given to Jewish life outside the State of Israel. You must remember that Zionism was a definition of Jewish identity not just for the people who went to live in the state, not just for the immigrants. It was also an identity for those who did not choose yet to go. Now, it's quite obvious that if one went to the State of Israel and lived in the Jewish community and spoke the Hebrew of the community and the like, then one was, of course, going to be a Jew in a new and different sense. But you see, even for those people who didn't immigrate, Zionism was their way of life. It was an affirmation of Jewish nationality. It was a preparation for going to the land. Or if it didn't quite get to a preparation for going to the land, it was beginning to live a national existence outside the land, so that eventually the theory of having a national home might come into being. Zionism became a pattern and a path for Jews who didn't want to go to the land of Palestine. Now, we sometimes think, because of our particular United States experience, that this only means culture. Yes, it does mean culture to a considerable extent. It means Hebrew, it means Jewish music, particularly folk song, it means dance, it means Jewish literature. It does mean that. But it means more than that. Zionism meant, particularly in Europe, a certain way of living one's total Jewish existence, in which the activities of one's party, or the group that one was affiliated within in the Zionist movement, became the core of one's Jewish identity. That what it was to be a Jew was to be a Jew by nationality and participate in the Jewish national activities which were channeled through the Zionist movement. Thus, for years until there was a Jewish state, a man could say he was a Jew because he was a Zionist. He participated in the activity. He was a man of the culture and a man of the political activity of the movement. That was his Jewishness. And that was a fully acceptable understanding of what it meant to be a Jew on a Zionist basis. Now, along comes the State of Israel. And what happens to this understanding of what it means to be a Jew? Not just a Zionist, mind you, but a Jew. Can a man who lives outside the State of Israel say he is a Jew by virtue of his Zionism, whatever that means? Now, the Zionist organization in the United States has had a terrible time trying to answer this question, as have the various Zionist groups all over the rest of the world. The problem has been particularly severe in the United States because while the vast majority of American Jews were concerned with the State of Israel, sought to get it established, saw its importance as a place of refuge, most of them weren't Zionists as a matter of primary Jewish identification. Most people didn't say, I will join the Zionist movement because that's how I'm going to show I'm a Jew. The average American Jew, thinks of being Jewish as he thinks of being a Catholic or a Protestant. It's primarily a religious matter of some kind or another, whatever that means. He's not quite sure he wants to get tangled with it. But that's his primary identity. Zionism was a means of helping those Jews who wanted to get to the state, to see to the establishment of the state. But once the state is established, once it's legally secure, once the Hatikvah becomes no longer the Jewish song, the song of the Jewish people, the anthem of the Jewish people, but the anthem of a foreign political state. Once what used to be the Jewish flag becomes a flag of a foreign political nation, the problem changes. The question is, what can Zionism mean to the American Jew? What can it mean that isn't given to him already by his religious activities and interests and orientation, at least for the overwhelming majority? So that as a result, the Zionist organization for the last 5 or 7 years has been busily engaged in trying to figure out what it means to be a Zionist in our day, which shows that they really don't know. And they're really engaged in quite a bit of difficulty, and it's a considerable problem to them. So far, there has not as yet emerged what one would think might emerge under such circumstances. There has not emerged any considerable thronging of Jews to an effort to give a non-religious definition of Judaism in the United States. It may be true that the average American Jew isn't very religious, but I think it's also quite true that insofar as he is a Jew, he doesn't, in overwhelming numbers, or even any great numbers, see Jewishness as somehow very far divorced from religion and very far distant from the synagogue of one kind or another. Now, Ben-Gurion does not share the problem of the Zionist Organization of America, nor does he share the problem of the World Zionist Organization, which has similarly sought to have ideological conferences to define the status of Zionism in our own day. Ben-Gurion's point is very simple. Before there was a state of Israel, Zionism was one thing. Couldn't be sure of going, maybe it was important to prepare, maybe there were difficulties which would prevent you. You didn't know it was going to be there. It was probably more helpful to stay outside the land for certain reasons, and maybe that was so in the early years of the state. But what is holding you back now, brother? If you really believe that Zionism means that a Jew is a Jew by virtue of participating in the Jewish nation, then why don't you come to the one place where the Jewish nation can carry on as a nation, on its land, and with its language, and in the midst of those who practice this nationality, who live this nationality, who are this nationality. This state is Israel. It is the incarnation of the Jewish people. Notice the name that was chosen for the state. It was a name which still causes considerable confusion to those who say, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." The Israel addressed there was not previously thought of as a political entity residing at the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. Before, when a Jew used to say, "Hear, O Israel," he meant the Jewish religious people, those who shared with him the covenant made by Abraham and God, renewed at Sinai with the entire people, and continued from generation to generation. "Oh no," said the Zionist movement, with Ben-Gurion at its head, "Israel is not some vague community, it's the state. It's this particular state in this particular, that is Israel. To be a member of Israel is to somehow have a relationship to this state on this land." And therefore he says, too, with regard to Zionism, you want to be a Zionist? Come to the land. Come to the land, for only here can you have the Jewish identity which is meaningful in modern time. Now it's interesting to take a look at some of the pieces of that identity. It's interesting to see what kind of a Jew Ben-Gurion is. What is there about him that somehow typifies the new breed of Jew? And it's interesting that without any question whatsoever, Ben-Gurion identifies himself not somehow with the European immigrants. He considers himself somehow almost a transplanted Sabra. He is one of the few Sabras born in Europe by mistake. But when he got to the land of Israel, then he found his real home. his roots, his identity, his life and spirit are really that of the Jewish community in the state of Israel. And therefore, in a way, he typifies everything which is positive and emergent and vibrant about the state. Now, to try to tick off a few of these things, in the first place, there's no question about the fact that Ben-Gurion is Hebraic linguistically. Hebrew is his language. Anyone who heard him read English the other night, even after a 3-year stay in the United States in his earlier days, knows that his language isn't English. He may still be able of conversing in Yiddish, and he reads Greek, we understand, and probably may read Sanskrit as well, since he's interested in Hindu philosophy. But his language is primarily Hebrew. When one picks up a speech by Ben-Gurion in Hebrew, it's Ben-Gurion's Hebrew. Of some of the older Zionist leaders, there is a question as to who is writing their speeches for them, or who has transposed it or put it into good Hebrew, of the older school, generally of the gentleman now no longer with us. But not of Ben-Gurion. He is Hebraic. Secondly, he is biblical. Say what you will about Ben-Gurion, he knows the Bible. The Bible is his book. It's almost his personal possession. You sometimes have the feeling he finds it difficult not to stop and look at you and give a long quotation, either from one of the prophets or one of the books of the Bible. He uses the Bible aptly and well. He knows the book. He is a man of the book. He is a man who feels a tremendous responsibility to Jews around the world. No question about his attitude toward other Jews and where they stand from, wherever they come from. He is a man of universal sympathies as far as Jews are concerned. And all his life, the actions which he has led in order to see to it that the Jewish community of what was then Palestine and now the state of Israel recognized its responsibilities towards Jews overseas. This is something in which he has shared. It is a love of Jews and things Jewish all over the world. And finally, he is a scholar. He is a lamdan, I guess I should say, in his own way. He's the kind of man who, when Chaim Weizmann died, saw to it that an invitation was issued to Albert Einstein to become president of the state of Israel. No more politically naive and sagacious choice at the same time could have been made. Albert Einstein as the president of anything, from Einstein's point of view, and the point of view at least of anyone who's read his biography, is absolutely unthinkable. To have as the president of the state a man whom, after he died, they opened his books and would occasionally find checks made out to him, used as bookmarks which had never been cashed. This may be all right for a scholar, but for the president of a modern state, unthinkable. Yet that was the kind of man that Ben-Gurion used his influence to see had the invitation to be president of the state of Israel. He is himself a man of some scholarship. Tomorrow afternoon he will spend rummaging around the bookshops of the city of New York. He had to catch Adenauer and Hammerschlag in the same day to leave an afternoon free to go look in bookshops. Now, what combines in all this is a robust, vital man of our world and our time who is at the same time Jewish. There is nothing as universal and particular a Jew in the last 150 years as a man like Ben-Gurion. He is a citizen of world culture. He speaks in terms of contemporary science. He speaks in terms of Greek philosophy and Hindu thought. Mind you, a Jew who pays attention to what Hindus have thought. You just don't have such a thing. And yet a man who is Hebraic and biblical and a man of the people at the same time. Now, this, I think, indicates what Ben-Gurion means. You want to be a Jew in our day. Do you really want to be a man of modern culture? Don't be a Moses Mendelssohn. Don't go look for these other things. They're all false. There's only one way really to do it. Be this kind of man who comes to the land. But, and this is the interesting point, don't think that you can create a meaningful Jewish identity through Zionism outside the land. And this is the negative part of what he is saying. You cannot hope to have a meaningful Jewish identity as a Zionist if you are outside the State of Israel. If you are a citizen of the State of Israel and temporarily go abroad in the service of the state or in the service of the Jewish people, or even as a matter of fact on some private business enterprise, if you are going back to the state, then you can be a Jew. You are a Jew by virtue of your roots, by virtue of your national ties, by virtue of your primary loyalties. That's because you know where you came from, and that's you know where you're going back to. But not if you're not going to the land. To hold out to yourself the Zionist movement as a means of saying, yes, I will be a Jew, but I'm not going to the State of Israel, is a contradiction in terms. It solves none of the basic problems, according to Ben-Gurion. Because you're not really a participant in the culture of the State of Israel, and you don't really have any basis of living in the country where you are as a Jew, because you don't have a Jewish community of fellow nationals with whom to share your culture. Thus, this point of Ben-Gurion's point of view as to what it means to be a Jew in modern time has created considerable havoc, but from my point of view has, I think, cleared the air very nicely. I think it's about time someone had the courage to say, well, what in the world does it mean to be a Zionist now that the State of Israel is here? Or perhaps to put the question better, can Zionism in any way be a primary identification in terms of his Jewishness for a Jew who lives outside the State of Israel? And I would tend to agree with Ben-Gurion, at least as far as the United States is concerned. In other countries, Zionism means immigration. The whole purpose of the Zionist organization, the whole activity of the schools which are run under Zionist auspices, the whole emphasis of the Israeli teachers who come to teach there is to get the people of that country to immigrate as soon as they can. This is not our American point of view. I think the American Jewish community as a whole would reject it, as it has continually year after year. And I believe, therefore, Ben-Gurion's stand makes the issue perfectly clear. Zionism without immigration cannot be a primary answer to what it means to be a Jew outside the State of Israel. And I, from my point of view, agree with Ben-Gurion. Now, there are a couple of other strands to Ben-Gurion's thought which we also must not allow to pass by. This emphasis upon Zionism, meaning immigration, is but part of Ben-Gurion's point of view with regard to the individual as a whole. For him, Zionism and Chalutziyut, in not just the sense of immigration now, but in the real sense of pioneering, are inseparable. The notion that one can talk about something without doing it is to Ben-Gurion not real Zionism, not real Jewishness. And the essence of Zionism is to be found in Chalutziyut, pioneering, the giving of the self to build the state, to create a land where a land is not, to tame the frontiers. Now, in a way, the notion of Chalutziyut goes back to our friend Leo Pinsker and the notion of auto-emancipation. The Chalutz is the man who is determined not only to build the state, but to build himself. In the American parlance, or in the parlance of general Zionism, Chalutziyut and immigration are generally taken to be the same thing. But we are talking of the kind of Chalutziyut in which Ben-Gurion himself is involved. He doesn't just talk about Chalutziyut, but in this magnificently dramatic display, he leaves the position of prime minister and goes to live as a member of a collective settlement in the Negev. He goes down to Sdei Boker, where he has a part in the communal settlement, and this is his home. He does not consider himself a man of the city. It is the Negev which is the frontier. Now, you must understand this, first of all, in terms of the immigration that had come to Palestine in the early days. This immigration which came to Palestine were the generations of small businessmen, the people who were involved in shopkeeping. If they weren't in shopkeeping, they were in petty trading. They were in second-hand clothes, or they were the beneficiary of communal jobs of one kind or another, the perpetual scholars. These people are the one who went out to tame the soil, to take the barren hillsides and somehow see that soil was planted on them again, to see to it that erosion was stopped by the planting of trees, the draining of swamps. This is the epic of the chalutz. The old yeshiva bacher become a farmer. The old second-hand clothes dealer who was now driving a tractor. It was the image of the Jew who was conquering the soil, but at the same time conquering himself. Therefore, Chalutziut means to Ben-Gurion, in the first place, the creation of the new type of Jew. The definite, willful effort on the part of the Jewish people to create a new kind of Jew. And secondly, it means also that the Jew finds himself in service to his people. It is not because it is pleasant, interesting, daring, or exciting to go out to the desert that Ben-Gurion says that we must have Jews go to the Negev and settle there. That's not the reason. It's not for thrills or kicks or for anything of this sort at all. They ought to do it as a service to the Jewish nation. The people needs chalutzim. If the state of Israel is to amount to anything, the Negev must be settled, must be conquered. Every resource of the Negev must become available to the Jewish nation as a whole. And what that needs then are people who are so inflamed with the meaning and the spirit of what the Jewish nation is and stands for that they will be willing to go and take this up. Now, saying that is quite a task. But this is what Ben-Gurion says the Zionist movement was called into being for. It was not called into being for personal pleasure. It was called to build a new Jew, and the Jew who fulfills himself in the establishment of his nation the way every other nation is set up. Seeing to it that this nation has the full range of activities and possibilities and the full-scale efforts of being a human being that all peoples have. But to say this also introduces a kind of moral note into what Ben-Gurion has to say on the subject of Zionism, which needs to be, again, added to. Chalutziut is only one emphasis of the Zionist movement. For Ben-Gurion, socialism and Zionism go hand in hand. Because if one takes the attitude that Zionism is a movement for the Jewish people as a whole, then the Jewish people should not be just a political entity, a political brotherhood. It should be an economic brotherhood as well. Ben-Gurion was one of the founders of the Histadrut, the great organization of organizations, the great cooperative of cooperative movements, which play such an enormous part in the shaping of the Israeli economy. The cooperative movement, as you well know, is a movement in which those who participate in it own the enterprises. Thus, it's not some ownership class which takes possession of the basic resources of the state or of the profits made up out of the hard work of the wage earners. But these enterprises belong to the wage earners themselves. The laborers own their own businesses. This isn't quite a full-scale socialistic economy in which every major enterprise in the state is owned by the government. It's rather the kind of thing that we see more of in the Scandinavian countries, in which the working class cooperating together begins to own and to profit from the activities of its own enterprise. And Ben-Gurion made his first great success in the State of Israel as the General Secretary of the Histadrut, the overall cooperative organization. It was through his work in the Histadrut that he rose to be the great political figure that he is. Now, having said that, I have to also indicate to you that his compulsion and his direction involved in this socialism of his is both in terms of his notion of the Jewish people, that all Jews should share with one another, and also because of the fact that he views the relationship among Jews as primarily a moral one. Ben-Gurion's biblicism, his knowledge of the Hebrew prophets and the rest, which would have to, in another man, be expressed through religion of one way or another, is to him expressed through the practical establishment of a social system in which equity is assured by the exchange of goods. To another man, this would have to be religion, would have to be piety, would have to be prayer. To Ben-Gurion, what the Bible has to say is primarily a matter of the way in which men live with one another, and primarily to be understood in the sharing of their goods, so that instead of the orphan and the widow being left out as they are in the Bible, requiring help, the society itself lives up to the admonitions of the prophets by caring for them. Yet all of this in Ben-Gurion is subject to one greater vision. Ben-Gurion is animated by a certain mystic ideal. I'm sure he would resent the term mystic because I don't think he considers himself a mystic in any way. And yet he is a man of a certain vision. He has a dream. He would not say that it was an exclusively Jewish dream, although the Jews may have given it its greatest expression. It is a dream which all men share. But insofar as all men share it, the Jews share it too. And what is it? It is the messianic hope. It is the hope of a day in which all men will come to live in peace and brotherhood and justice with one another. This is the dominating motif of Ben-Gurion's Zionism. The Jewish people living on its own soil must, as every other people, strive to help that messianic dream come to be. For we can no longer depend upon God. All we can depend upon is man. There is a spiritual dimension to man. There is a moral dimension to man. That's quite clear. But it needs to be realized. It needs to be lived up to. And the whole Zionist enterprise, the whole enterprise of founding the state of Israel, everything that is involved in chalutziyut, that is involved in socialism, takes its meaning in terms of a whole point of view of history at which all of this is fulfilled. It is out of this vision that he feels the motive comes from, both for the establishment of the state and for the kind of activity which it carries on in our day. To him it would be unthinkable to have had a Zionist movement without the great Jewish messianic ideals which went before. And to him personally, so it would seem, everything that he is a part of is part of one great historic drama which is moving toward a far-off conclusion. If you did indeed believe that there must come a day when all men live together as brothers, when justice would be established upon the earth, when, so to speak, the kingdom of God, whatever that meant in ancient times, was established in practical terms in our own day, and that because you were a human being, because you had knowledge, because you had understanding, because you had a spiritual dimension, that you too could carry this out, this would be a tremendous spur to live a certain kind of life, to build a certain kind of society. It is at moments like this, when Ben-Gurion is at his most rapturous, that he is also, in a way, at his most seductive. He becomes almost for a moment a kind of prophet. This halo of white hair that he wears around his bald head begins to take on dimensions not so much of a politician, to use it in its very American sense, as more of a prophet, one who builds a state looking forward, not just for the momentary gains or losses, but who looks forward toward a vision of all mankind. Surely this is nothing less than one of the most extraordinary figures in the pages of Jewish history. Surely the fact that this man has been the prime minister of the state of Israel for most of the 11 years of its existence, soon to be 12, surely this is going to have a whole influence upon the history of the state of Israel. The poor prime ministers who come along will have to make believe that in one way or another they are specialists at something. They've got to be a little bit of a scholar in order to live up. Linguistically, they've got to be men who know the Bible and refer to the Bible somehow, although, of course, we shall have deviates from this point of view. He set a terrible standard for them. But I don't think any of us really can help but look at Ben-Gurion and say, that man's a Jew. He's really a Jew. Don't care whether your standard is religious or Yiddishist or anything. Ben-Gurion is a Jew. He is as Jew in as real a legitimate sense as almost any Jew that has ever been. But he's also a modern Jew. Can hardly be any question about the fact that a figure like Ben-Gurion, even though he may be authentic and legitimate to the whole Jewish tradition, couldn't have existed even 50 years ago. A man who is both deeply Jewish and yet completely universal, who is a citizen of modern culture in every way, yet there's no question about the fact that there's Jewish roots. And I think our estimate of Ben-Gurion therefore proves his point. Zionism, in the sense of coming to the state of Israel and living this kind of life, is indeed one of the great major answers to what it means to be a Jew in modern times. And I think anyone who cannot find satisfaction in any other answer should at least recognize that one great, extraordinary answer has been given. And I don't see that we should look with any shame or suspicion or worry or concern about Jews who cannot be satisfied with any other kind of Jewish identity other than this full-blooded, vigorous, vital kind of Jewish identity which is offered by the State of Israel. There is no reason for saying Kaddish when an American Jew or two or several hundred or even several thousand should leave the country to immigrate to the State of Israel. It is as legitimate a way of living one's life as immigrating to any other country is for any other American. And for a Jew who finds himself torn and disturbed and distraught on the American scene with the answers that we have to give here, which I shall go into in the following weeks, I think this is a legitimate and successful and in a way magnificent answer. But there are certain problems connected with it. There are certain problems connected with it which must keep us from saying that it is a completely successful solution. And I think the questions, even with our admiration for the answer, must be raised. Now, in the first place, Ben-Gurion, who says that there can't be any real Jewish life as a Zionist in the Golah, the exile, would go further. Not only cannot there be any real Jewish life without, as a Zionist in the Golah, but if he were forced to the issue, I am certain he would say that there cannot long be any meaningful Jewish life outside the State of Israel altogether. And he rejects, as a matter of fact, the kind of Jewish life which has been produced in the diaspora. In a very interesting series of letters which he exchanged with the professor of history or philosophy, I think philosophy, although he has written on the philosophy of history recently, in a very interesting exchange of letters with Professor Nathan Rotenstreich of the Hebrew University, he had a long and intriguing discussion of the relationship of the Jew of the State of Israel to the relationship of the Jew in the State of Israel to the Jew of the diaspora. And the position Ben-Gurion took was a quite simple one. I'm going to overstate it, but maybe it will be clear. A Jew born and growing up in the State of Israel, notice with whom Ben-Gurion identifies himself, a Sabra, has really more personal relationship with Joshua in the biblical books than he has with Peretz or Shalom Aleichem or anything produced in the diaspora. The qualitative change of Jewish life produced by living on the land and on the soil has been so great that much of what has been produced in the diaspora becomes, after a while, relatively meaningless. Yes, it's interesting. It's a record of a valiant effort by this people to survive, but one certainly doesn't, when one has the full-blooded variety, one begins to recognize the ersatz, the substitute for the real thing. The reason that the Bible is so meaningful to the Jew of the State of Israel is that he recognizes himself in it. It's his story. But when he reads of Mendele Mocher Sforim, or some of the other authors of the ghetto, he doesn't recognize himself. He doesn't see himself. He doesn't see this as somehow a genuine reflection of what it means to be a Jew. Now, this is the position which Ben-Gurion has taken, and I think it's a logical position from where he stands. But it's a difficult decision to make. Does one take 2,000 years of Jewish history? Not a small amount. May I remind you that Jewish history outside the state of Israel is longer than Jewish history inside the state of Israel. It's a little difficult to know quite when Moses came out of Egypt and quite when the Jews got into Palestine, but certainly not much before the year 1500, before the time of Jesus. And you can't stretch it to much past 100 or 200 years. Well, the best we can possibly manage is 1,700 years. Well, we've been a little over 1,700 years in the diaspora, and the history of the diaspora goes back longer than that. And besides which, you not only reject Sholem Aleichem and Mendele and Peretz, you have to reject Maimonides. You have to reject the entire medieval Spanish Jewish literature as being interesting footnotes, but not really authentically Jewish. And, of course, one might argue as to whether or not one doesn't have to reject the Talmud, too. Now, of course, the Talmud is slightly different, remember, because the Talmud is written in Aramaic, which is almost Hebrew, and the Jews lived in autonomous communities, which trace their roots back to biblical times, and they had a close relationship to the state of Israel. But, by and large, it seems to me, the necessity of Ben-Gurion's argument would be to reject the Talmud, too, and I don't think he would shirk from it. Maybe one of the things that held the Jews back was the kind of reasoning and logic and legality which they got into. I think I'm pressing him too far. But look at the problem. If the only kind of authentic Jewish life is the life of the Jewish people living on its own soil with its own language, you are led to reject the major segment of Jewish history and some of the major Jewish contributions to the development, at least of Jews, if not of mankind as a whole, over the last 2,000 years. Secondly, it is magnificent to see the way in which the Jewish community of the State of Israel has indeed lived up to the prophetic admonitions in building the society, the ingathering of the exiles, the sacrifice of those who are part of the community so that immigrants might come in. The building of the cooperative movement has really been a great moral enterprise. It is indeed one of the great expressions of a basic religious feeling that we've seen in our time. But it's interesting to see what's happening to it. The kibbutz movement in Israel is going into a decline. The chalutz is no longer the great romantic figure he once was. To the contrary, it is precisely because there has been a flagging interest in chalutziyut, in the youth of the big cities, to go out to the countryside, that Ben-Gurion has had to place so much emphasis upon this. If it weren't for the army and the kind of work which the army has been doing to get young people to give a certain amount of labor and service in some of these places, it would be doubtful if Israel would be able to find the manpower it needs to man the out-of-the-way spots. The great problems of the state of Israel, now that the state has been established and that the state has been going on, has been exactly the same kind of problem that we have found in the United States. Perhaps different in degree, but the same kind of problem. With the growth of consumer goods, with the rise in income, there has been a consequent lag in morale. Morale, in this case, spelled M-O-R-A-L-S. The problem has been whether or not the idealism of the Zionist movement, which Ben-Gurion has felt all over the years could be an adequate expression of the prophetic movement, whether it will long continue simply because of the fact that children are taught to read the Bible in the public school. Or to put it another way, when Ben-Gurion speaks of messianism, it is quite clear that he is a man with a certain kind of faith. Not religious faith in any identifiable form, to be sure. Faith in man. He has a great vision of what man is and what man is capable of. He has an understanding of what it means for man to be a spiritual being, a person of intellect, of reason, of will, a man of conscience, of moral sense and moral fiber. Ben-Gurion has faith in man. He has a vision of the capacities of the individual to grow and develop, and of men using their intelligence and their sensitivity to become more than what they are today. And it is out of this faith in man that he has faith in history and in society. He can look forward to linking his life to the life of other men, and with these other men building a certain kind of society. When Ben-Gurion speaks of Zionism, he is speaking of the fulfillment of a certain elemental belief which moves him beyond anything else. And to see this is to make one believe that possibly for a modern man, this is really an appropriate substitute for religion. But one doesn't find it in most other leading Israeli spokesmen. Ben-Gurion is unique precisely in the fact that with his Zionism there is blended this certain kind of faith. It's interesting that at this recent ideological congress in 1957, that a good many of the other speakers decried, denied, almost poked sly fun at this kind of mystical point of view of Ben-Gurion's. For them to be a state is to be a state. To have a land and a language, that's enough, that's sufficient. And this brings us to the critical question. In Ben-Gurion, to be sure, there is a successful fusion of what was spiritual about the Jewish people before with this given man who is a Zionist par excellence. But can there long be a meaningful kind of Jewish identity without the dimension of faith? This is the critical question. In Ben-Gurion, there is a kind of faith. It's a humanist faith, to be sure. The Jewish people throughout its history, at least since the time of Ezra, and possibly if the prophetic point of view is to be adopted even before that, the Jewish people has been a people primarily by virtue of its religious identification, by virtue of a relationship to God. Now, mind you, this is an American point of view which I am presenting, and it's a point of view of one who accepts the American attitude in this regard. But it's the question that we Americans must ask. We can understand Ben-Gurion as a successful fusion. But supposing there were a Zionist like Ben-Gurion without the vision, without the faith, supposing he were simply a man of land and language who knew the old books, yes, and who might have even been willing to be moral, yes, but without this vision, supposing this turns out to be a people like other people who settle on a land, who build a state, and who try to divide its profits rather equitably, except insofar as they have to attract outside capital, and gradually they'll try to equalize that too. Is this the kind of Jewish identity which is still meaningful in terms of the tradition? Now, there are many Israelis who would say, of course, it's the only kind of identity which makes sense. And it is here that we must stop and question. It is here that if one takes a religious point of view, the answer has to be no. From the religious point of view, it will only be insofar as the state itself conforms to certain standards, religious standards, even if they're not the standards of traditional orthodoxy. Insofar as the community of those who live in the state are permeated by the religious ideals, I'll put it on as simple a level as that this will have any real connection with Jewishness for us. Now, I mentioned the basic problem here in advance to you. You'll recall a week ago, I think I tried to mention to you the problem involved in creating a sense of religiosity in a state where the choice was either between an orthodoxy which doesn't want to move forward or modernity. There is some kind of a striving, some sort of a movement inside the state of Israel to bring about some kind of a religious expression which will be both Jewish and yet modern. There are a few little groups and circles meeting here and there. There are a few questioning people. There are a few individuals who are very much concerned with the continuing place of religion within the life of the Jewish community. But just as Ben-Gurion has solved the problem in a way, he also makes clear the real difficulties. Ben-Gurion will go down in history as one of the great Jews of all time, one of the great exemplars of what it means to be a Jew in modern times. But will the state of Israel bring forth other Ben-Gurions? Or is Ben-Gurion the kind of man he is because he grew up in the ghetto? Because he was born in an atmosphere steeped in Jewish faith? Because willy-nilly he took into himself the faith of the Bible? Because he was willing to believe in the prophets as well as in the standards which they created? This is the critical problem before which we stand. So that even though I can understand those Jews who are willing to accept and understand and take upon themselves the kind of Jewish identity which is offered by the state of Israel, I don't believe it's an automatic solution. And I don't believe by any means that it's a final solution, because by my standards, the state itself is only a solution insofar as it lives up to other standards. And as I shall try to be saying to you during the next few weeks, I believe these standards can be lived up to under another form and with other problems outside the state of Israel. May I conclude simply by pointing out to you the difference between Israelism and Zionism. It's interesting that when the movement was founded, over a period of time, the name which it took for itself was the Zionist movement. Now, what is Zion? Zion specifically is a geographical entity. It's a mountain, a hill, a good-sized hill. By now it's not even that, outside the city of Jerusalem, or what was at one time outside the city of Jerusalem, where the temple was. It became, in the biblical literature, the prophetic literature, the dream to see Zion restored. Now, the restoration of Zion, of course, seems to have meant the restoration of the temple, a Jewish national existence as the existence of the people of this temple, a place where worship to God was carried out and the like. But the restoration of Zion, interestingly enough, was a really messianic dream. To restore Zion meant to set up the Jewish community in Palestine as it ought to be. Zionism, in a way, therefore, hasn't reached its goal, the real Zionism, the final Zionism. What we have is the state of Israel. What we don't have is Zion. One can therefore be one of the lovers of Zion, and one who is interested in Zion, and see in the state of Israel today something far different from it. While recognizing the valuable, the significant, the almost indispensable contributions it has meant to defining what is a modern Jew, one can at the same time recognize that there are both serious problems involved in this definition, and recognize that it is a long way both from its goals, or at least from the goals which the Jewish tradition set for it. Now I'm going to stop here and give you a last crack at questions on the Zionist movement. Yes?
Would you say that Israelism was sort of a watered-down practicality of Zionism, or that it's something so totally different that it can scarcely nourish?
Well, in Ben-Gurion's case, it comes very close to merging, doesn't it? What's good for the state of Israel, he interprets in both moral and prophetic and messianic terms. Therefore, his realpolitik, his political maneuvers, one has the feeling are somehow, one hopes to have the feeling that they are somehow motivated by moral ends. So that the Sinai campaign, as uncomfortable as it might have made American Jews feel, at least one could have the feeling that maybe this was legitimate self-defense. Of course, nobody starts a war these days except in self-defense. Hitler was being attacked, and As we all know, the Japanese were being invaded by the Chinese from the Manchurian border. So, it's very easy to use the other way around. On the other hand, when Ben-Gurion is involved in this kind of thing, one somehow has the feeling that if this man really stands for what he says this is legitimate self-defense. And I think, as a matter of fact, people have tended a lot more to see the Sinai campaign as sensible today than they did during the few hours that it was on. But supposing it wasn't Ben-Gurion, supposing it was somebody whose loyalty was to the nation, not to the messianic vision and not to the moral goals. Oh yes, he was moral too. I'm not trying to say he's not an out fascist. But supposing his being a Jew meant to live up to the standards of what was good for this nation, then we would be involved in a far different kind of situation. Now, from my point of view, that kind of situation would be a far cry from what is involved in Zionism as the expression of the Jewish people. But the expression of the Jewish people and what it has stood for is, to me, essentially a religious one. Therefore, I have to weigh what goes on in the state and in terms of its activities on a religious basis. Practical, political, day by day, living in the kind of, how did Kessler put it so nicely, political ice age in which we live, but by religious standards nonetheless. And that's precisely the ambivalence which one can feel toward the state of Israel as an expression of Jewish identity in our own day. One may be able to trust Ben-Gurion, but can one trust the state to continue in this way after Ben-Gurion is not there? Yes?
So this is a conflict between him and Weizmann. I remember reading when we read the autobiography of Weizmann, criticism was, he didn't mention Ben-Gurion maybe once or twice in a very superficial way, and that was criticism of the book. I'm just wondering if what we talked about tonight was the basis of the difference between the two men.
It's a little difficult to state it exactly, and I'm going to overstate it again because I think it will make it clear. Weizmann, and in a way Moshe Sharet, took the position that the only way one can get anything done in the world today is by playing along with the big powers. And Weizmann, I guess because of his close personal association with many of the important British leaders, wanted to rely very heavily on them. Ben-Gurion was for auto-emancipation. He was for the Jews striking out for their rights as they saw fit. And the eventual removal of Sharet from the government of the State of Israel, even from any association with the Foreign Office, came by virtue of this same kind of attitude, probably. The big powers would not approve of the Sinai campaign. And what Sharet would have probably wanted to do would be to deal with the British and the Americans and try to secure moral opinion of the world and the rest to solve this problem. Ben-Gurion, whom, as you may recall, is also Minister of Defense as well as Prime Minister, ordered the Sinai campaign. Now, it's an entirely different kind of attitude, and I think it's this difference which separated the two men.
Yeah, I was going to ask, suppose we take Ben-Gurion on his expressed views, and we do have an gathering of all the Jews into Israel, assuming that the state could support it, which is questionable. Wouldn't it tend to some extent to deprive the rest of the world of countries such as this of what many people consider the tremendous benefit that the Jewish contribution has made to all the different other sectors of the world?
You see, that's why I started out by saying that Ben-Gurion wasn't a systematic thinker, you know. There are 2 million, well, I'll go back to it in a moment. There are 2 million Jews today in the state of Israel. That's about 1 million more than some people thought could ever get in 10 10 or 15 years ago when this question was being debated about the economic absorptive capacity. I remember hearing those words over and over again till it came out of the ears. 1 million Jews with Palestine on this side of the Jordan was all that it could ever hold, plus the Arab population. There are 2 million Jews. There's room for plenty more, particularly if any of them ever wanted to start going down to the Negev, and even if they don't, there's still room for quite a few more Jews there. And I don't think Ben-Gurion would take the position that Palestine can ever hold all the Jews. But I do think he has the very definite feeling, perhaps as Minister of Defense, and certainly as Prime Minister, that one of the most important factors in stabilizing the state and building up its position vis-a-vis the Jews of the rest of the world will be the continuing immigration of Jews to the state of Israel. Now, how many can they hold? I guess he would say as many as they possibly can hold. Any Jew who wants to come can come. What about those who stay outside the state of Israel? What will happen to them? Well, insofar as it's possible for them to survive, well and good. The state of Israel will do what it can to help them. It will try to do anything that it possibly can to keep them alive culturally and the like. Ben-Gurion doesn't really see any future for the Jewish religion. Therefore, my guess would be, if pressed to the wall, he would say that over a period of time, perhaps they will die, but we will do our best to keep them alive. Now, your point was, wouldn't it be terrible to deprive other countries of their contribution? Well, but don't you see, the people who can't come will eventually become assimilated in part of the population of the countries where they are. If there are 11 million Jews alive today, and the state of Israel could hold a couple more million, or maybe 3 more million, God knows how many.
Assimilated, you mean lose their identity?
Eventually, over a period of time. The Jews who were resident in China did that. The Jews who were resident in a number of countries have lost their identity, and their energies were merged. Some of the great names, even of the United States, have a Jewish background. Every once in a while one reads of the famous Mrs. August Belmont of the Metropolitan Opera Guild. Well, the Belmonts were a Jewish family at one time, but they're not a Jewish family any longer. Half the Guggenheim family is gone. A good number of the Schiffs, whose plaque is outside here in the hall, is one of the great founders of this institution. A good number of the Schiffs are gone. Some of the Warburgs and certainly some of the Rosenwalds have begun to drift off along to the side. It's not difficult. Particularly the richer you are, the less difficult it is. But, if there is no meaningful Jewish identity, people will drift off all over. Yes?
Do you attribute any religious power in Israeli religious in the sense that you see spiritual religion, not merely observance, and not merely the forming of theocratic state? Do you think there is hope in the Israeli organization, which is holding the balance of power to keep Israel from being strictly becoming strictly secular state, which you seem to fear?
Well, I'm going to give you a very uncharitable answer, for which I'm sorry. But, if you're asking an honest question, I'll give you an honest answer. I think, from every point of view, if I may be permitted to say so, the Mizrahi is doing more harm than good. Why? In the first place, it has identified Jewish religion with an organized political movement. Political party which runs candidates and fights other candidates. It has gotten, therefore, a certain kind of concessions which it has been able to win from the government and enact into law. But it has lost thereby its right to stand over against the entire apparatus of the state and say that religion is independent of politics, and that a man can be religious and a member of any one of a number of political parties, and that religion has something to say to all political parties. A. B. The Mizrahi movement in the state of Israel is, so far as I can tell from this distance, of rather traditionally, and by traditionally I mean European-oriented Orthodox Judaism. I don't think that in traditional Orthodox Judaism, even with certain modifications in the state of Israel, can meet the needs of a modern contemporary society. This was what I was discussing with you when I was discussing the points of view of Professor Leibowitz last week. And while he himself is an observant Jew, I think that unless an alternative is provided in the state of Israel between modern, scientifically oriented secularism and traditional, hold the line, Orthodox Judaism, I am afraid the overwhelming majority of the residents of the State of Israel will choose modern secularism. I think under those circumstances I would be strongly tempted to do so, but then again I am not Orthodox. So that from my point of view, since you asked the question, I do not find the Mizrahi Party to be very helpful in resolving this issue.
It isn't because they will have no power unless they do the political model. It isn't because they're afraid of just what you afraid of.
I don't believe that at all. I don't believe that at all. I believe that a religion wields more power by not wielding political power. I mean, the experience in the United States indicates that religion is more powerful in the United States because there are no religious parties. There's no Catholic action here. There's no Christian Democratic Front representing one or another church groups. Religion in the United States stands over against all parties. And it's at its worst only when it gets tied up with any one of the political issues. Now the question is, what kind of power should a religion wield? If you are really concerned about whether or not the buses go on Shabbos or not, and that's more important than almost anything else, if that's what religion is, then maybe the Mizrahi is right, but this is not my point of view. You see, you're dealing with a person who is not Orthodox. And because I am not Orthodox, therefore, I have to give you an answer which says that I think this is all wrong. I think the approach is wrong. I think the gains are the wrong gains. They've won a few points on the operation of buses on Shabbos and on the raising of pigs and a few other things, all of which, it seems to me, are losing the battle while winning the skirmishes. The critical, forgive me, 1 second. The critical battle, it seems to me, is for the hearts of the ensuing generations. And I am afraid that a Marxist, materialist, scientific, vague humanism is winning out. And to my point of view, this is not what the Jewish tradition has stood for. And being something of a religious person, I don't believe it's the basis upon which any long-ranging morality or messianism can grow. And I believe these both to be critical to the Jewish people. But that's my answer. Yes?
I was just saying, maybe the majority of people in Israel are not the Orthodox and the younger people, 20 to 30 years of age, who are voting citizens, they're very resentful, very antagonistic.
You know, it creates all kinds of problems, too. You win a few points, but when you win one of those points, everybody who's not a member of your party is against your party, not only for its politics, but also for its religion. Well, that's killing.
There's a great deal of case because the Nazis there was difficult with the Orthodox in the army.
Yes, this was a more complicated problem. Yeah. Yes?
Do that lack the same concept, religious concept, in the American scene?
Well, you'll have to find out next week and the week after and the week after. I reserve the final 3 weeks of the course to bring us back to the American scene. And I don't expect to finish by saying that the solution is any more positive in America. I believe that there are as many problems, maybe more problems, than the state of Israel. But the same religious concern will be the kind of concern which I hope to be able to bring to bear upon the American scene. And I assure you that in my criticisms of what passes for American Jewish religiosity, I shall try to have the same kind of impartial, friendly criticism which I was willing to give to those who live in the state of Israel and have problems in living up to a Zionism which is as much concerned with Zion as it is concerned with Medinat Israel. I hope so. You will have to check me on it. Yes?
Would you say that Mr. Ben-Gurion's policy is drifting toward the Beirut Party's policy?
No, this is an area in which I would carefully stay out. I'll tell you why. The question was, are Mr. Ben-Gurion's policies drifting toward the Beirut Party? There's always a tendency when somebody else is gaining votes to kind of steal away one or two of their planks or platforms so as to make sure they don't get too many. Although in the last election he seemed to do pretty well. The Beirut Party didn't make the gains that most of the political observers anticipated that it would make. The Mapai Party did unusually well. However, I'm not qualified to discuss that. My own interest in these matters and the field that I would consider my own competence is in ideology, philosophy, and in the world of ideas. And even there, it's a considerable bit of chutzpah to try to cover what I have tried to cover during the course of this year. So if you don't mind, I'll stay out of the political analysis where I know I'm involved in chutzpah. Yes?
In this discussion tonight, it seems to me that this was the view, this conflict between secularism and religion is the view of the European Jew in Israel. What role does the Oriental Jew play now, or what role will he play eventually?
Well, he hasn't played much of a role yet, besides kicking up something of a fuss last summer with a series of riots. And we don't know what role he is going to play because of the fact that, by and large, this problem is only at its beginnings. You must remember that the Oriental Jew comes not from the ghetto, but out of virtual slavery. He is not accustomed to having a role and a part to play in a modern state. He has got to go not just from the 17th or the 15th century into the 20th century. Very often he has to go from the 8th century or the 7th century. He's got a long distance to go. Now, there are only certain basic social frictions which are felt at the moment. It's entirely possible that someone will come along and organize this mass of Oriental Jewish feeling against the East European Jews and convert the state of Israel toward another direction. But so far it's not there. And as a matter of fact, the Oriental Jews are as much divided among themselves as they are divided from a good many of the Ashkenazi Jews. So at the moment we're not in a position to make any judgment on it, at least. No. By and large, there's a tendency there to be far more naively traditional. But what happens when the naivete is lost in the modern society? Now, the Yemenite group has managed to maintain a considerable amount of its unique qualities over the period of time that Yemenite Jews have been in the state of Israel. But the bulk of the Yemenite community has only been there since the state has been established. And we're only talking about 10 years, 12 years. It doesn't amount to anything. Now, when 3 and 5 generations of Yemenite Jews have been there, then we will know what happens. When these children grow up under a scientific atmosphere, under an atmosphere in which men and women have a certain kind of relationship that they don't have. And when I say that to you, I am very conscious immediately what will happen in the American Jewish community when we have American Jews who have been here 3 to 5 generations. In the whole room, I don't think we can find anyone who can trace both sides of his family back 3 generations in the United States. I'm positive there's no one here who can trace both sides back 5, and I'd be willing to take a bet with you that most of you can't trace either side anywhere back 5 generations. I had a friend who could trace 5 generations back through one part of his family in the United States. But the reason that I remember him is because it's so unusual. One last, did you have a question? No, fine. Yes, one last quick question. Yes, please.
In terms of the Bible, the prophets were continually saying that when Israel lost the vision of God, then Israel was lost.
Yes, that's what they said, wasn't it?
In Ben-Gurion's view, it would appear that anti-Semitism was the glue which kept the Jews together.
Yes, social factors. One doesn't really pay attention to these rather naive, unscientific views of the universe, just as we have given up alchemy and the Ptolemaic notion of the revolving heavens, so we have given up these rather naive ways of looking at man. Now don't misunderstand, they had a vision of man which was supreme and superb, but it was founded upon a mystical concept which no man of the 20th century would be willing to take up, at least until next week at 6:15.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.